Hello and welcome to Provoking Tech. I'm Zach, and in today's video, I'm going to be doing a reaction time test using humanbenchmark.com to gauge the effects of latency using different cloud streaming clients and how that really affects my reaction time. I'll be first doing a local test just to kind of gauge what my baseline is, and then moving on to the Paperspace web client, followed by the Parsec client, and then finally the Liquid Sky client. So without further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Humanbenchmark.com's reaction time test is a neat little web application that essentially allows you to play a little game and get a generalized benchmark of your reaction time. Essentially, you get 5 tries to play this game, and it builds an average based upon that. The kind of generalized basics of this game is once you click on this blue box, it'll turn red immediately, and the moment that box turns green, you're supposed to click it, and it uses that to kind of build your reaction time. Of course, it's not super accurate, but I figured it'd be a nice little cool test to just get some generalized reaction times, both on my local machine, kind of using that as a baseline, and then running on the Paperspace web client, which I've used. It's neat. It's super simple. All you have to do is log in through a web browser, and you can get on your cloud machine, which is super handy. But I have noticed some latency in that, so I'm going to see if this will kind of back up my personal experience and see if I'm just imagining it or if there really is increased latency in my reaction times. My Paperspace web client, and then I'm also going to test on the Parsec client as well as the Liquid Sky client. So I'm very interested to see what these results are. I'm only going to really film the first set of 5 on my local machine. I don't want to show all 15 or really show all 4 devices that I'm going to be testing on, simply because it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to be a pretty boring video if you ask me. So I'm going to go ahead and test once, and so you can kind of see it and see kind of what the process is, and then I'll go ahead and test twice more on this machine and then move on to the cloud machines. After I do all that, I'll come back with a kind of summary based upon my findings and see kind of how everything stacks up. All right, so in the very first set of tests on my local machine, I ended up with an average of 251. So that's not the greatest by any means, but it does serve as a good baseline. So I'm going to go ahead and run this entire test twice more on my local machine and then move on to the cloud machines. All right, so the first graph that I'm showing is just the pure raw data of my reaction times. The first set of data is my local test. The following set is the Paperspace web client. And then the next set of data is the Parsec client. And then finally, the Liquid Sky client. So kind of my general baseline as my reaction time is around 250 milliseconds with the local test, which is kind of the best case scenario for this test, as I have no extra added latency from the streaming client. The Paperspace web client, as expected, had a massive jump, and it was big enough in real life that I can notice a difference if I'm using the web client for certain different applications, especially gaming, of course, but even more like work-oriented tasks, such as 3D CAD. I can notice it decently, and like things like video editing, I can definitely notice the added latency. Parsec seemed to be the fastest kind of game streaming client or super low latency client, and it seemed to impact my reaction time the least, although Liquid Sky wasn't too far behind it. But there is a clear edge here where Parsec is getting a little bit better than Liquid Sky, and Liquid Sky seemed to affect my reaction times slightly more. Of course, your mileage may vary, but these are just some of the results from just the pure data that I collected from doing the test. I probably could have got away with only doing the test once. As you can see, the tests are fairly close, except for the Paperspace. There was a pretty big jump here, but the added latency is so much there that the kind of results had a wider swing than my local test did. All right, so this next graph is actually an adjustment from the baseline. So I've set my local to be equal to 100%, and then I've adjusted each of these results from that baseline. So you can see here the next quickest from the baseline is the Parsec client. which is roughly at 125%, so 1.25 times my local test. The following is Liquid Sky, which is closer to 135, so 1.35 times. And finally, the Paperspace web client is up there in between 180 and 200, probably pretty close to 190%, so 1.9 times. So you can do the same exact test on your local machine and kind of use these adjustments from the baseline to multiply your results to kind of get a general feel of what you might expect. So for parsec, if you're wanting to know what your added reaction time might be, you can just take your local test and times it by 1.25 roughly to get you kind of your parsec reaction time. For Liquid Sky, you can do the same thing. It'll be 1.35 times. And finally, for the Paperspace web client, you can just take it times roughly 1.9 to kind of get your reaction time if you would have done it on that client. So all in all, the cloud clients, or the clients that are kind of designed and marketed to gamers, had decent, big enough increases to the reaction time, but small enough to really not be noticeable in my day-to-day use of these clients. But there is big enough that it was measurable. And another thing just to keep in mind is that this was just a cool little video to kind of show some real world test and the results of different clients on my reaction time. This is not super scientific, but it is a decent real world test. So that's pretty much it for today's video, guys. Hopefully you found it enjoyable as well as informative, and hopefully you gained a little bit more insight into the different cloud apps and how they might affect your reaction times. The results were both surprising in parts as well as kind of expected. For the Paperspace web client, for example, I did expect it to be roughly around the 2 times mark, simply because I definitely do notice that added reaction time when using their web client. With their desktop client, I don't notice it as much, but it definitely is not near the levels of the Parsec or the Liquid Sky clients. But their web client, I definitely did notice it, and that's why I did include it in the test. And that's not to say that it's not useful, because there's a lot of different applications that you might use for non-gaming purposes that don't need a super fast reaction time. So there definitely are uses, and it's definitely handy to be able to run it straight from a web browser. So I just wanted to include it in the test too. The Parsec and the Liquid Sky test, I did expect to be actually slightly lower than they were, simply because the added reaction time that they add, I really don't notice that in the real world when going from playing like a game locally to playing that game on one of their clients. And I really expected that kind of increase to be a little bit lower, but I guess it is such a small increase in the grand scheme of things that it really isn't noticeable unless you pay a ton of attention. So after doing these tests, I did dig a little deeper into this, and I found out that the average human's reaction time is roughly between 200 to 225 milliseconds for a visual stimulus. So I'm slightly above that mark, but I do highly recommend that you go to the human benchmark test. I'll leave that linked in the description below, and just doing it for yourself. And you can go back to the previous segment where I actually give the numbers to multiply by to have a rough idea of what your reaction time might be with the different cloud clients. So once again, guys, I'm definitely going to wrap this video up now. If you liked this video, give it a big like. I do greatly appreciate that, guys. And also, if you're not already an existing subscriber, smash that subscribe button to stay tuned for more great videos from Thought Provoking Tech. And until next time, guys, Zach out.